There have been various forms of representing negative numbers, and the first mention of negative numbers can be traced back to the 200 before the Common Era, back to the Chinese counting rods, where they used the color black to represent negative numbers, and they used the color red to represent positive numbers. This is the first ever representation of negative numbers that we know of. They use vertical rods and horizontal rods to distinguish between different place values. So if we were to represent 5,381 in the Chinese counting rods notation, I would represent it in red because it is positive. And I am going to start with the ones place, and that will be vertical rods. Then we will have horizontal rods for the tens place, vertical for the hundreds place, and horizontal for the thousands. Now, if I were to represent 5 using horizontal rods, I would use 5 rods like that, 3 vertical ones, then I would use 8, the horizontal 8, and then I would use vertical 1. Now, if I were to say that 5,381 was negative, I would use the color black. The place values are still the same. So I would still use horizontal 5, vertical 3, horizontal 8, and vertical 1. After a while, they realized that they couldn't just use 2 different colors all the time, which is when Li Yi came up with a different notation. In the time frame of 1234 to 1260, a diagonal stroke was used on the last digit, and that replaced the black and the red. That was the more advanced notation. So if we were to use 5,381, again, it would still be used, or we would still use the horizontal 5, vertical 3, horizontal 8, and vertical 1. The only thing now is if this was negative, I would draw a diagonal stroke through the last digit. And that was a notation by Li Yi. In about 620 Common Era, in India, there was the idea of debts and fortunes for negative numbers, and that was accepted. There was a special negative notation by Brahmagupta, and I'm not sure, I couldn't find that notation, but there are some special rules that they came up with when dealing with positive and negative quantities, which are the same rules that we know of today. They're just written in mathematical notation. The idea of negative numbers overall was accepted by people. The problem was when they ran into a negative square or a negative number to an equation. That was the only time where negative numbers became frustrating and confusing to deal with. The positive and the negative symbol that are used today, that was invented by the Egyptian later on. But these were the early forms of negative number notation. Later on in the homework, you will be asked to represent negative and positive numbers using Chinese counting rod. And we will be asking of a translation of the debts and fortunes statements that we have here.